Hi, this is a brief overview of the introductory portion of our Leading School Improvement course. We'll focus most of this introduction on the work of Chenoweth, among other researchers who have done a lot of work in understanding the essence of what it means to instructionally lead schools through change and continuous improvement. This is a rich area, and the learning outcomes are really focusing in on several elements of how school reform and improvement of instructional systems have come about in the last few years. Focusing really on systems and systems thinking. And when we say systems, we don't mean school systems or districts. We mean systems within a school as they relate to student learning. And also understanding the importance of what it means to convene and lead teams of people, helping develop people through the process of continuous improvement and creating a professional learning community of educators, students, and all that are involved. And so Karen Chenoweth's work is really at the forefront. She is from the Education Trust, and as a researcher, the Education Trust is an organization that has been fully dedicated to bridging equity gaps, particularly equity when it comes to socioeconomics, which we'll talk a good bit about in this course. And so her research really has honed in on these outlier schools, what she calls the unexpected schools, the schools that we don't expect to be proficient and high performing because they have a large population of economically disadvantaged students. That, as you can see from the trend line in blue, is not the norm. They are called outliers. And so in these schools, expertise is not enough. Just having good teachers, just having good leadership, people that know what they're doing, isn't necessarily enough. It's really creating the systems. And you can see the different comments written here. These are all the characteristics that she found in her initial research in 2007 on these unexpected schools. They focus on what students need to learn. They collaborate in how they teach. They assess, and they find in the data, they find patterns to adjust, and they build their relationships. And so principals of these schools all share a strong belief in the capacity of their students, and that drives them to work to ensure the success of all students in their schools. And so systems are important because there are generally in schools not systematic ways of making sure teachers knew what the standards are and what's required of all students. And there's no systematic way to ensure teachers teach those standards. They typically close the door, and what happens in there happens in there. There's no systematic way to identify the students that had not mastered those standards, and there's no systematic way to recognize what teachers were doing a better job than others. And so creating systems to change these statements from there is a systematic way is really the essence of what we're talking about. And when we say systems, we think of the alphabet soup, among other things, depending on the context of the school and the size and the level, but things like RTI, PBIS, teams, PLCs, SBDMs, other things in your school that in many cases they exist, but they need to be systematized, working together and aligned effectively for the sake of the vision and the outcomes that are required for students in that school, all students in that school. One of the particularly poignant comments and metaphors that Chenoweth uses is the engineering metaphor, talking about the Brooklyn Bridge. And the Brooklyn Bridge, when it was built, was an engineering marvel. But it wasn't seen as an outlier. It was seen as a blueprint for the fact that we can do this. And instead of being an outlier, that they've breached this major waterway separating Brooklyn from Manhattan in New York City, they harness that as the model for effective engineering feats that continue to be built upon and built upon and built upon. And she talks about the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, which is the bridge below. You can see a much wider waterway. This is waterway also in New York City that is at the cusp of the Atlantic that separates Brooklyn from Staten Island. And a bigger engineering marvel, but really built upon the knowledge and understanding of the Brooklyn Bridge. So using the Brooklyn Bridge not as an outlier, but as a model for continuous development of the engineering profession is a metaphor for how schools can not look at the schools that are doing it right in developing outcomes for students, particularly those that are the most disadvantaged, looking at them as outliers, but looking at them as the ways to systematize this type of work. And so leadership is necessary for this work to happen. Leadership is really critical. And this is a study from Karen Seashore Lewis and Keith Leithwood that was a groundbreaking study in 2010 that really, all the emphasis up until then was really focused on, we know that having a good teacher is the most important thing. And that still holds true, but studies like Leithwood's study has really honed in on the importance of leadership. And this is what guided the Wallace Foundation to begin funding programs to develop leaders for schools. And of course, Western's program has been developed with support from the Wallace Foundation that's really inspired by this very research. So what you are learning and what we are doing in the curriculum in this program is a Wallace Foundation supported effort that is really based on and built on the shoulders of all this work. The statement there, to date, we have not found a single case of a school improving its student achievement record in the absence of talented leadership. Now, the question that we'll spend a good bit of time dissecting and unpacking for the remainder of the term is, how do you define talented leadership? But nevertheless, this and other findings from Wallace Foundation studies like this one that talked about the effectiveness and the importance of principles and the effect sizes of principles for student achievement. Not quite what a teacher is, but it's awful close to what a teacher is. And the combination of quality teacher and quality principal is really significant, particularly when it comes to the equity lens and understanding how to deal with students that come to school with a lot of challenges and that are marginalized. A really good graphic understanding of what we're talking about here with school and school student outcomes built on leadership behaviors that really align to the core part of what we're going to talk about here. And of course, the instructional core is paramount in the work of the PELT model at Harvard, which is also one of the models of instructional leadership that really guide this work that we will focus on. If you hadn't learned about the instructional core from Richard Elmore in the 602 course, or you're not familiar with his instructional rounds model, this is the essence of his belief, and that's the idea that, and research, and that's the idea that the instructional core is central to everything that happens with student learning. And the instructional core is this trifecta of elements, these three elements, and that's the level of content, the rigor of the curriculum, the teacher's knowledge and skill, and the engagement of students. And if you change any single element of this core, you have to change the other two. And the instructional rounds model that Elmore developed, that many of you I know have participated in, is all about looking at what's happening in the classroom with the tasks, with what the work is that the students are doing. And the real accountability system is one that looks at these tasks and looks to see if you can see the core. And Elmore famously says, if you can't see it in the core, it's not there. It's not, if it's not in the tasks, the core is not there, and you have to look at where you can bring that core together. And so that's an important element as well. There's a whole host of other research studies, and we'll touch on just a few. This work from NCEE I really like because it very closely aligns with the improvement science model and the continuous improvement using a benchmarking culture with incentives for high performance and distributed leadership that values expertise. The organization of schools around non-teaching time, around teacher collaboration and workspaces that are conducive to this type of thing, with time efficiency, efficient use of learning time, staff that follow students, and parent and community engagement are all really critical. And the effective school framework. This goes back to when I was taking these courses in graduate school, and Ron Edmonds from Harvard did a lot of this original effective schools work, and it's amazing how it's held the test of time. Strong administrative leadership, a climate of expectation, especially for disadvantaged students, an atmosphere that's orderly but not rigid, basic skills taking priority over other activities, and student progress that's frequently monitored. Chicago research, if you're not familiar with that, is also groundbreaking in the way it identified leadership, effective leaders, as one of the 5 most important factors in the essential supports. Instruction in that core is the center of it, but also having supportive environments involve families, collaborative teaching, collaborative teachers, and effective leaders. Michael Fuller is another towering person in the educational leadership field. He's from the University of Toronto, identified these 5 leadership capacities that are all very similar to what we've already discussed. The idea that student excellence and educator excellence are flip sides of the same coin, I think, is a really good way of explaining the importance of that. But I really like the bullet points below, where Fullen talks about how principals directly influence how teachers learn together. And so creating that climate that allows for teacher collaboration and finding the time for that collaboration. And the essence really of what he talks about is that groups of teachers working together in purposeful ways over periods of time will produce greater learning. And so really the summary of all of this, from Leithwood's research to the collective research of Chenoweth and Edmonds and the Chicago work, to Fullen and Elmore, it basically demonstrates that knowledge exists on how to structure schools to make kids smarter. And that's really the basis. This is no longer a theory. The importance of principles and leadership is no longer a theory. It is the basis of what we do. And it's something that I'm excited to take you on the journey through as we unpack that this semester.